number 2 now, where I'm talking about the mental health conference and what came out of that. So coming on in from Sarah McCulloch's presentation, the autistic occupational therapist, which is talking about challenges autistic people face who go to mental health teams. Challenge 4, she said that the diagnostic process is essential to the medical model, but that it is not fit for purpose. Diagnostic process essential to the medical model, but it's not fit for purpose. I'm not quite sure what she meant by that, because personally I do, and I know this is controversial, but personally I don't really have much issue with the medical model. I do feel it needs to be, I do feel there are some problems with it, and it's not like, it definitely needed addressing in some areas, because there were some problems with it. And I sort of feel we need to have more kind of joined up social and medical model. Like I feel that they're both equally valid in different scenarios. Like when you're advocating for your needs in terms of reasonable adjustments, you're calling for social model. But say if you need diagnosis, or if you want to like talk about your impairments, or if you need trying to look for potential interventions on the brain and things like that, and you're looking at a medical model, and I sort of feel like they're both equally applicable in different situations, and I don't feel it's very helpful to talk about scenarios where we completely get rid of the medical model. I just think that's kind of fantasy thinking, and often it's very able autistics who talk like this, and I feel that often it actually risks harming people who actually are a bit more disabled, because for them the medical model can be really important in advocating for themselves. Like yes, some of us do actually have disorders, some of us do actually have impairments, and some of us actually rely on structures recognising those. So, you know, I actually feel sometimes that actually being open about my limitations and accepting them can actually help my self-esteem, because I end up beating myself up about things, because I know I've got like problems of the brain essentially. You know, if you're talking about it as a medical thing, you're hardly going to beat yourself up about it. So I do actually quite like a medical model in some places. It's controversial, but I do feel that we do need certain medical descriptions, and I'm not sure what she meant by saying the diagnostic process is not fit for purpose. I mean, certainly it needs looking at, because it has historically underrepresented women and ethnic minorities and so on. But yeah, I think other than that, it's fairly okay. But she also said that the diagnostic tools are recommended for complex cases, but services are being overwhelmed by people who are not complex. So in other words, a lot of people who, she said, part of the reason why there's such long diagnostic waiting times is that services are being overwhelmed by less complex cases. Again, I'm not entirely sure what she meant by that, really, but she said that these less complex cases should be dealt with in secondary care rather than going to specialist services. So in other words, they should be dealt with in-house, like in a mental health team, and be diagnosed within the mental health team as opposed to being assessed by specialist services. She said they don't all need an ADOS, that's the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule assessment. She said they don't all need the ADOS, as they should be able to simply provide a clinical letter and a generic secondary care in the same way they do for people with so-called obvious bipolar or psychosis or whatever. So they should just be diagnosed in-house really by non-specialists on a generic way. Personally, I disagree, because I feel that autism is like a very complex neurodevelopmental condition with origins in childhood, and it's quite different to later onset conditions like bipolar and other conditions that are encountered in mental health teams. And I feel because it is so complex, it does need assessment by a specialist. And I disagree with this whole despecialisation, which seems to be happening increasingly in this sort of postmodern world, where people kind of defer to non-experts, and I do feel we need experts, and I feel particularly for something as complex and as serious as autism, that it should be properly diagnosed as it currently is, and as good practice says it should be. You need a multidisciplinary team. That's how I was assessed. I actually said I needed to be assessed by a multidisciplinary team, because I was quite a straightforward case anyway. There was no doubt that I was autistic. He had no problem diagnosing me, but I wanted to see a multidisciplinary team. I guess because I'm the type of person that needs a really thorough assessment, because I don't like to do things by halves. So I was like, no, I need to take a full team, because you're just one person. I need to have this verified properly. I'd have a brain scan if one was available as well. So I saw the full team. But I just think that's good practice anyway, and it should be done. But often they don't do that because of funding and stuff. But this whole idea that it should be done in-house doesn't sit well with me. It needs to be done by specialist services, as autism is a complex condition, in my view. She talked about people who have learned to cope, who don't get picked up by services, but are looking for impairment and looking for historical childhood delays. But again, I sort of disagree with her there, because some autistic people do learn to cope, admittedly, but autism is an impairment. That's just my view. It is an impairment, I do feel. And quite clearly they should be looking for impairments, because autism is an impairment. And personally, I know this is controversial, if you don't have an impairment, why would you go for a diagnosis in the first place? But again, that's just my view. And she also talks about people who have had no questions raised about their development when children, which again, I sort of feel, autism is a childhood condition, it does develop in childhood. And if issues only present as in adulthood, are they really autistic? But again, I know that's controversial, but I do feel that, I do feel that sometimes this whole neurodiversity paradigm is taking things too far, and you end up with people who actually might not even be autistic, but thinking they are. But actually, if their condition develops in adulthood and it's not there in childhood, they're not autistic, because for autism has to develop in childhood. It's a childhood condition. Most signs are there by the time you're about 3. Sometimes even younger than that. It's often the first signs become apparent around the age of 1 or 2, actually. I know in my case, there are concerns from about 1 or 2, but it's the thing, autism develops in childhood. These concerns, even parents will notice them, that's the thing. No amount of masking will camouflage the signs, so I disagree with that. Clinicians should be sceptical if it wasn't obvious in childhood, because there are clear signs. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to notice those signs. So but parents will notice them, because parents are with the child all the time. So a parent will notice them, even if other people don't. It's going to be some, concerns basically. In my case, teachers and my parents were aware of them. It's just that obviously they didn't have autism as in the narrative back then, because it's back in the 90s, or at least not for people who weren't stereotypical. So, again, she talks about autistic women who frequently fail the adults due to camouflaging. Again, I don't really want to go into detail about this now, so we'll just skim through it actually. But that's what she said. She talks about it being impairment-based, but again, as I said, I disagree, because I think autism is an impairment. She was told by a psychiatrist that she couldn't be autistic if she wasn't diagnosed by the age of 3. Now that just comes down to ignorance. Clearly lots of autistic people are missed in childhood, and just because you weren't diagnosed in childhood doesn't mean you're not autistic, clearly. So that just comes down to ignorance. So it's shocking actually that some people can still think that. Autism is a childhood condition. It develops in childhood and the signs will be there, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get diagnosed in childhood. And then she talks about what is autism. She says that people are often told they have difficulty reading social cues, they have difficulty understanding other people, but autism is much more holistic than that. So in other words, although autism is fundamentally a social condition, obviously it does cover way more areas than just social. It's a lot more holistic than that. She says, it defines who we are, what we're interested in. She talks about autistics much more likely to have autistic friends, they're more likely to get on with autistic people, not just about social skills, everything someone does could do autistically. I agree, obviously autism does affect way more than just social skills, and obviously autism is a pervasive thing, it affects every area of a person's life. Personally, in my experience, I don't necessarily get on better with other autistic people, so I disagree with that. For me, it very much depends on the person, whether or not I'm on their wavelength. And just because someone's autistic doesn't mean necessarily I'm going to get on with them, particularly if they're very different life experiences to me. Like I said before, I might not get on with a successful autistic that I just can't relate to. Just because they share the same diagnosis doesn't mean they're going to understand what it's like to be on benefits, doesn't mean they're going to understand what it's like never to have worked and stuff. So just because someone shares the same diagnosis as me doesn't mean necessarily I'm going to have a connection. And I could get on really well with a neurotypical person because they share the same interests as me, because maybe I don't know, I'm on the same wavelength because I like their communication style or whatever. I see people as people first and foremost, and connection is way more complex than whether or not someone just shares the same diagnosis as you, isn't it? That's my personal opinion. We get along with people on so many different levels. It's not just one thing that determines whether or not we're going to get on with another person. Many autistic people I can't stand who really irritate me, and many neurotypical people I get on with just fine. So, and then she talks about the future, the need to dismantle existing diagnostic pathways, replace them with simple, universally understood processes, away from specialist services, and into something every clinician can do. I fundamentally disagree with that, and I really hope it does not happen. Currently, that does not happen. Thankfully, we do have specialist services, but I feel that is just, in a way, it's despecialisation I can't stand. We should actually be putting more money into specialist services because, like I say, autism is a specialised thing. I just don't see how it can be diagnosed by generic clinicians. It really needs specialists to diagnose it. But, like I say, there is a trend in the neurodiversity movement, I feel, sometimes to kind of demedicalise autism, and also even towards self-diagnosis, which I can't stand because, you can't self-diagnose autism or any complex neurobiological thing. You can't really self-diagnose anything, really, unless you've been actually assessed by someone who knows what they're talking about. But particularly not something like autism. I'm really against that trend. If someone says to me that if it's